Waking up for what felt like the thousandth time, David opened his eyes to the noise of whining. Without even looking, he knew who the culprit was. It was his 6-year-old Staffordshire Bull Terrier, Eddie. Since moving into this Montgomery townhouse 4 months ago, this whining routine at the top of the stairs had become quite a regular occurrence. Reaching for his recently bought earplugs, David tried to silence Eddie with those. He had tried talking to Eddie, tried persuading him to settle on his bed like he usually did. But nothing worked. He would start the night on David's bed, moving to the landing on random nights to quietly whine and cry, refusing to move. David couldn't fathom what had brought on the change in Eddie. He had Googled the problem, which suggested he spray the area in case there was a scent of past pets. David had done this and even had the carpets cleaned. Nothing worked, and curiously, Eddie never did this during the day. Working from home as an accountant, Eddie was rarely left alone. Around a week later, David was tending to his overgrown lawn when the lady from across the street stopped to fuss Eddie. "How are you settling in?" asked the neighbor. "Good, thank you," replied David. "I used to live not far from here when I was a child. I've always liked the area," David added. "It is a nice area. I've lived on this street over 30 years and I've never had any bother. I'm Fran, by the way. I live with my husband Yanni at number 1822 inch," the neighbor replied. "Nice to meet you. I'm Dave, and this fussy monster is Eddie. We are just sorting the weeds in hopes I'll have it looking nice for summer. I work from home, so a nice place to sit in the garden would be lovely," David explained. "It's nice to see this place alive again. It was left empty for a good 6 years. The old occupants were a young couple with a baby. She actually moved in whilst pregnant, if I'm remembering correctly. Paige her name was, and I can't remember the husband's name. He left after." Fran paused before continuing to speak. "Well, I don't like to gossip," Fran trailed off, leaving David not sure what to say. "Well, Dave, it was lovely to meet you, and you too, Eddie," Fran said whilst giving Eddie another much appreciated fuss. "It was lovely to meet you too, wasn't it, Eddie?" David replied. "Enjoy the rest of your day, don't work too hard," Fran replied whilst crossing the street to her house. David watched Fran walk away, wondering what it was Fran didn't want to gossip about. He regretted not asking more questions about the old owners. Fran seemed to know a lot about this street and his house. Most of the neighbors he had come across had moved to the street within the last 5 years, just like himself. 2 nights later, David woke to Eddie whining on the stairs. Knowing nothing he said would deter Eddie from what he was doing, he again reached for his earplugs. As David turned to retrieve them from his bedside table, he noticed Eddie wasn't whining anymore. Instead, he was fussing, as though he was greeting someone. At the thought of someone being outside his bedroom door, David stood up so fast he felt the blood rush to his head. Feeling his heart hammering in his chest, David walked to the bedroom door that was ajar, allowing Eddie in and out. He could just make out Eddie's tail wagging like crazy, but the rest of Eddie was obscured by the door. As David reached out and opened the door fully, Eddie turned and looked at him. Eddie's ears were back and he was still wagging his tail. There was no one there, just Eddie. David sighed, feeling silly for getting so anxious. He wasn't usually jumpy like this. After trying to coax Eddie back to his bed without success, David gave up. Putting his earplugs in, he left Eddie on the landing and went to sleep. After that night, Eddie stopped sleeping in David's bed altogether and would go straight to the landing at bedtime. David tried everything he could think of to get Eddie back into his old routine. Nothing helped. Weeks later, David was working in the garden with his laptop when he noticed Eddie jumping up at the fence trying to get someone's attention. It was Fran. She was crossing the road towards them. David saw an opportunity to get some history on his home. Standing up, he waved at Fran, who waved back. "How's my favorite K9?" she said, greeting Eddie. "He's clearly happy to see you," David laughed. Not knowing how to approach the subject, David found himself just straight asking Fran, "What do you know about the people that used to live at this house?" he inquired. Fran paused for a moment and then replied, "Is there a particular reason you're asking?" David wasn't sure how much he should say. He didn't want to sound as though he was scared of his house when he wasn't. But his curiosity had been building for weeks, ever since Fran had said, "I don't like to gossip." David found himself explaining how Eddie had been acting over the last few months. "I'm sure it's just Eddie settling in," he concluded his story with a little laugh. That's when he noticed Fran wasn't smiling. Her brows were scrunched together, showing what looked like concern. For a moment neither of them spoke. Fran just looked back at him with a concerned, thoughtful look on her face. Finally Fran broke the silence. "I don't know how much you was told about the house before you moved in, but it does have history." David felt uneasy about the way Fran said history. "What happened here, if you don't mind me asking?" David continued. "I'm not easily scared and I won't think you're a gossip, I promise," David chuckled, trying to keep the mood light, but he could see from Fran's expression that was not working. After another pause which felt like an hour, Fran started to tell the story she knew. Paige, her name was. I can't recall what her husband was called, or their daughter for that matter. The husband moved out less than a year of living here, leaving Paige to live here alone for years. Awful tragedy it was what happened to their daughter. She died at just a month old. Cot death, they said it was. The husband was gone a few weeks later. I remember him turning up with a van, and I never saw him again after he left. Paige was never the same after that, and I hardly saw her out of the house. It was a few years after the tragedy with their daughter. Late one night I noticed police and an ambulance outside of Paige's house. I wasn't trying to be nosy, I just hoped Paige was okay. I knew she lived alone, you see. Anyway, that's when I saw the paramedics bring a body out on a stretcher. Covered with a black tarpaulin zip bag. I was shocked to my core. I couldn't understand what had happened. Paige was in her late 20s, early 30s at the most. I just couldn't understand what could have taken her life. I went outside, and was instantly met with an officer asking me to go back inside. I asked what had happened, but he would not tell me. I assumed she had been attacked and told the officer I was concerned for the residents' safety. What if there was a dangerous person on the loose? We had a right to know. That's when the officer reluctantly explained that it wasn't an attack, the residents would be safe. He told me that sadly Paige had been found hanging at the top of the stairs. She had used the loft hatch to secure a noose and decided to take her own life. Fran finished what she was saying, and finally took in David's expression. He had gone white and his easy smile was gone, his brows were bunched together looking concerned.